Most of our biology is built around water. Our ecosystem around us is built on water. Our planet is mostly water. It's the common denominator of all life on our planet. So the quality of water is essential to our health.
Today's Into Healing guest is Dr. Chris Metro, a naturopathic and Oriental medicine doctor. In this episode, he explores how water influences our physical, mental, and emotional well-being, and how nature is our most powerful teacher. This is Into Healing, and I'm your host, Mira Kaddoura. This episode is sponsored by The Healing Order, a clinic that empowers patients with a tailored combination of holistic treatments, herbs, and education to support the body's innate ability to heal. If you enjoy this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter, intohealing.com/newsletter, for one book recommendation, one quote, and one daily practice delivered straight to your inbox. Hi, Dr. Metro.
Hi.
I'm so grateful to have you here. Your background in engineering, in chemistry, in Chinese and natural medicine is going to inform this conversation we're going to have so beautifully. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Can you share a little bit more about your family background and kind of, what your father, grandfather did and how that influenced your path?
I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and it's an area that is on the border with Canada, and we share the Great Lakes system. It's right between Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. So the ecology of our environment is a part of our life as a young person, influenced by my grandmother, people around me who were very much an advocate for conservation and the importance of the health of our environment around us. At that time, I think I was 10 or 12 years old. Love Canal became a big issue. That was in the early 70s. And Love Canal sat on the river between the two lake systems. And back then, because of the access to water and power, there was a lot of industry around that Great Lakes system. And so that generated, of course, a lot of industrial waste. I think through the 30s, 40s, 50s, the practices changed quite a lot. There was a time where industry would just put that down into the river and let it run through the watershed. Of course, that only lasts so long because it starts to affect the fish and the ecology. My grandfather worked a lot in that industry, being a chemist, and knew a lot about that Love Canal situation. And the conversation was always around, well, was there something we could have done better, right? That had a lasting impact on me in the sense that a lot of the standard of living and the technology that we live with comes with a cost.
And oftentimes, even when things have clear intentions, they don't have necessarily good long-term effects, right?
Correct. Yeah. My dad is a food chemist, and I had the chance to go with him to the production facility with the hope of drinking some juice. And at that
This is
time,
as a teenager?
Yeah, in my early teens, 12, 13. And I couldn't have this particular juice because it contained a red dye in it. And it opened up a conversation as to why we didn't really consume things with red dyes and issues around food. And at that time, he explained that this particular dye caused cancer. And it was like, phew. With these other things that I was becoming aware of as a young person, it was shocking to me that we would put this in food. That's a big issue as the mechanized diet over the last century has had its health consequences for us all. But the reality is that people would not buy these products unless they looked the real thing, because apparently cranberry juice is brown when processed.
People don't want to drink brown juice.
Correct. Yeah. If you grow your own food and you have a relationship with a garden, you realize that things aren't always perfect. My grandparents still came from that Victory Garden era, and it was a big part of supplementing or getting a lot of our food, especially herbs. I still remember walking the fence and picking the green beans, right? Certain times of the year you had certain things, but when you see how things are grown and you have access to that, it changes the way you see the world around you.
Yeah, 100%.
Now we're in a world where much of our food's coming from 1,000 miles away, out of state, somewhere out of country. The dynamics of what's happening around us are changing quite quickly without us really recognizing or seeing it.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit about your journey into the healing space? Like, what did you study and how did you end up where you're at right now?
Well, I have always had an affinity for the sciences, and chemistry was very easy and exciting for me. I was fortunate enough to graduate and work in industry. I started out working in plastics at a molding compound facility in upstate New York near Niagara Falls, much of which is around us to this day. Our cars, a lot of the things that we have in our homes and garages and are made from these molding compounds. And it was an exposure to the inside of industry. And at that time, I was fortunate enough to work into the research and development group and became a chloralkali specialist. I work in the petrochemical industry in the research and development for about 6 years. Much of the things that we were producing and supplying to industry were the feedstocks for many different branches of manufacturing. And it exposed me to pulp and paper mills, to tobacco, cigarette facilities, to places down in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, to working with solvents in California. And that opportunity opened my eyes to this greater web of industry and how it impacted and improved our standard of living, but of course at the same time with consequences, right? Fortunately, over that period of time, I was able to continue my interests in natural medicine. Just on the side, my mom was in medicine. She worked 45 years in nursery with preemies.
Oh, wow.
My uncle worked with blind rehabilitation and talked about this school in Oregon that still taught natural medicine. The Chinese medicine program, which for me was the most compelling explanation of how functional systems interconnect. It was a profound opportunity to learn a system of thinking that relates to the body as a whole. Of course, we're mostly water, and the importance of how those systems interact is really in that fabric of water, essentially.
Yeah, powerful. You said to me, people want to do good things, but decisions are made by top corporations and highest systems of power, and often the system fails us. Can you share a little bit more about that, specifically how sometimes even the best inventions or innovations have long-term consequences?
There was the way I kind of view it is the chemistry of the early 1900s. There was an explosion where we had this innovation as a country. You know, it's kind of the strength of the U.S. to innovate and create technologies, advances in sciences that bring improvements in our standard of living. But unfortunately, in that short-term window of advancement, we don't see the long-term consequences necessarily. When we study things individually, we don't often see their interrelationship or how that might play out over time. We're seeing that a little bit right now in some of these stories around forever chemicals, things that most everyone knows, from Gore-Tex to Teflon, things that made our lives so much more convenient, but now come at a very high cost. So I'm always looking at what are those long-term benefits for us as a whole, but what are those consequences for us individually. The other thing that I witnessed was how something might be introduced in trace amounts, but over time accumulate and compound. We see that in fish, right? In marine biology, where farther up the food chain, we often see complications for fish that are feeding on the algae or the smaller aquatic life, because that toxicity accumulates on a small scale, but it has consequences in the larger realm. We're no different. We're a top predator, if you want to say that, or a lot of the things that are around us that accumulate have profound impacts on us in subtle ways. Early on, my interest in these excipients or food additives became of interest to me because of the way they affect our biology. They can affect our mood. They can affect our reproductive health. But when we look at those things individually, sometimes we don't see the consequences. But when we put all those factors together, the consequences become much clearer. I remember in the 90s that the average exposure weekly for chemicals was ranging around 1,300 chemicals, somewhere in there.
On a daily basis?
On a weekly basis.
Wow.
By the time we studied environmental medicine in med school, that had ballooned to about 8,000. So this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. We've seen in each sequence of 5 years, I think by 2015, we were up to 30,000 per week. And I think recent estimates now are 80,000 per week.
And this is just from food and things we eat and
Environment.
drink. Oh, environment.
Everything.
Everything, huh?
I had a patient question earlier today, just trying to answer some things, and it was about off-gassing with carpet and paints. There are things around us all the time. Much of those things we don't even catch their odor threshold because they're not something
So
we're aware
subtle.
of.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't taste it. But these things have accumulative effects. I think regulators are well-intended. They live here. They live in the same environment. But there's pressures, economic pressures, political pressures that change these decisions. I try to focus on the individual things that we can do day to day and focus on not getting sick, trying to be healthy.
So how do we have more bodily agency and not rely on systems that are meant to keep us safe? How do we kind of take ownership of, our bodies and what we put into them?
I think just keeping it simple is the most effective approach. Many traditions have always felt that what you choose to eat, choose to feed your friends, your family, is the highest expression of yourself. It's something that spans our background, our knowledge, our economic abilities. But simple has always been the most effective. There's more than enough studies showing that people who eat whole food diets are very successful. The most important thing that we can do on a regular basis is keep it simple. Take care of our local economies, our local farms, our local food centers, and eat simply. It's not easy to do. I know we're all very busy. We have busy lives, but we can support certain businesses, right?
So I want to center our conversation around water, which is a fundamental human right, as we've discussed before, and something you know so much about. Can you give us some historical context on how and why water is essential?
Most of our biology is built around water. Our ecosystem around us is built on water. Our planet is mostly water. It's the common denominator of all life on our planet. So the quality of water is essential to our health and our economy and our vitality and our long-term rejuvenative systems, right? We're in a cycle, I think, the last couple of decades about sustainability. And I struggled with that because, as we talked, It meant holding on to what you have.
Your sustaining systems.
And the school of thought in Chinese medicine that I studied under was the art of nourishing life, looking at regenerative systems, ways of doing things that benefit that around us. We live through a very strong Darwinian cycle where survival of the fittest really kind of dominated our landscape. But what we've come to learn now is that we're really in a symbiotic cycle where we really have to recognize our interrelationships. We can think on the larger scale, but we have to think and focus on our local scale. In medicine, we take a Hippocratic oath. Hippocrates lived 500 BC, I think. And he was well aware and recognizing the value of water and its importance. We see it as a way of bathing our wounds, our daily hygiene. Here in the modern times, the advancements came with the ability to deliver disinfected water on a large scale to homes directly, free of disease, free of pathogens, things that would really limit people's health and vitality. Of course, as things go through those different systems, they change in their quality. Sometimes they pick up things that aren't so good for us in small amounts. Sometimes they become more vibrant. One of the researchers that interested me a long time ago was Theodor Schwenk. He was an anthroposophical person from Germany who was also an engineer and wrote books. I think it was called Sensitive Chaos. And he looked at how water flowed through nature, how it moved through and had this softness to it, where it could move around rocks. He talked a lot about as water moves through a system, it can gain vitality or it can lose vitality, depending on how it's allowed to move. Water has several phases. All of us have learned solid, liquid, and gas. Now, research, I think out of the University of Washington, Dr. Pollack has written a book called The Fourth Phase of Water, talking about how there's this other quality to water due to its polarity to help fluid dynamic systems or gels. We know that in our body because in our joints, we don't really hear them creak like a door hinge, right? Is one of their famous analogies. The vitality of water, of course, is important to us. One of the things that he put in his book was the mosaics of water with these drop tests. And he showed that water from different sources had a vibrancy or a frequency or a vibration. You have to remember this was the turn of, just after last century, and so technology is a little different, but he had these still shots of how water would ripple or move through and almost be reflective of the source that it came from. And he was looking at municipal water versus spring water and showed these wonderful mosaic palettes from these sources. Yet in these industrial situations, how there was a different vibration or knowledge within that water that he could only elicit through these photographs. I thought that was fascinating. Recently, I think there was a researcher, Emoto, who did something similar.
Looking messages of water.
Yeah. And what was fascinating, I thought about that, was the way it crystallized, right? I think now Professor Pollack up in Washington is taking that a step farther and talking about this other phase of water. It's a ability to have and organize itself. In many ways, it's a colloidal relationship. Water has fundamentally two hydrogens and an oxygen bond. And because of that polarity, it has a very specific angle. It's not a direct angle. It's, I think, a 130-degree angle. But it organizes itself in a colloidal relationship. And that's what we're learning in these new understandings of how, and colloidal relationships in chemistry are how chemicals interact, how they share conductivity or
information,
electricity, which is information. In our body, being mostly water, we have mixed functional proteins, fats, things that organize itself into our connective tissue, our organ structure, our nervous system. But all of that is just to contain the water. All of those cells are in a fluid system. Outside of that system, of course, is the lymphatic tree, the lymph system. In nature, that's our watershed. In our body, our lymph system is directly related to our health. The vibrancy or health of our lymph system dictates our function, our health, our vitality. If we're not giving ourselves healthy sources of water through vegetables, fruit, things we drink, we suffer consequences within that lymphatic system.
You've told me when water moves through the world, it gets different vitality, potency, vibrancy, sometimes picking up healthy minerals, sometimes picking up plastics. I'd love you to expand on the power and importance of water and how it moves through the world in relation to what it picks up.
Things that we find in our water are evolving and changing along with technology around us. We're now in a situation where we're looking at forever chemicals or microplastics, things that bring tremendous convenience to our lives with great consequence. It wasn't really very well understood, I think, until recently, how to measure or how to study these influences in our environment. Of course, there's other influences. We witnessed just recently in some of our communities changes in those water supplies that had dramatic consequences for the community. Flint, Michigan is an incredible example where instead of pulling from the lake, we started pulling from the river. And in doing so, changed the quality of the water flowing through that system and inadvertently exposed people to things that will affect them for the rest of their life. There's so many things to consider when we look at this question because it's the fabric of the world we live in is essentially water. It delivers the nutrients that we need. The digestive system is there to extract nutrition, discard and help us get waste out of our body. But there is a burden in our system through the kidneys and the filtration systems of our liver that have to filter those things that we take in, but also those things that we secrete. Hydration is a critical part of our vitality. Unfortunately, for many people, the access to whole foods can change during the course of the year or change depending on where they live. And this directly influences their vitality because the water within those plants and vegetables, fruits, really dictate their own vitality, how those plants were grown, what water was used. Early on in my clinical career, we had an issue over heavy metal toxicity with a specific patient. And this patient was doing everything to the highest standards, organic foods, whole foods, anti-inflammatory diet. Yet we saw an increase in heavy metals. What we came to learn was the carrots that they were using as a part of their diet. They were on a juicing program. Though they were certified from an organic facility, carrots were still leaching and cleaning heavy metals from the soil. So it wasn't that these practices weren't being done to a high standard. It was that that food was pulling from the ground and inadvertently affecting this individual.
How has drinking water been used to heal?
Drinking water is critical to our normal physiology and health. We have to drink so many ounces essentially a day. It's something we all are required. In medical school, I remember the statistic you needed to have somewhere around half your body weight in ounces a day. But that, of course, includes what you eat as well. For me, trying to do that, caused other problems, going to the bathroom more frequently, not being able to sleep. So there's certainly a balance to things that we do. What was interesting to me was this blue zone studies that were presented at different parts of the world where people are living to be 100 with great vitality. There's a number of common themes: community, whole foods, simplicity, purpose, living with the environment around them, but quality of water. Here in the U.S., one of those blue zone areas is down in Loma Linda, California. And of course, it's a major practice for them to drink water. It's just a common part of their daily practice.
Since we're talking about drinking water, I want to really dig into how it affects the body. So we obviously, our human body's, 70% water? I heard you say water is the substrate of life or of the soul. Can you speak to us about that?
Without water, we don't have that luxury to pursue the passions of our life. There's a hierarchy of need, I think, right? That's spoken a lot about. Safe homes, secure food. Water is one of those hierarchy of need. On a regular basis, it's important for us to have adequate, healthy access to water. I think we talked about your experiences growing up where water conservation was a big issue, having to plan ahead.
Yeah, growing up, we never had, still, clean drinking water is an issue, and we didn't even have water all the time. So sometimes we would just have to fill up bathtubs and, conserve water. And when the water came, and then when the water stopped, there was no water. So bucket showers and all that stuff.
Water represents abundance and the ability for us to maintain and sustain abundance. Many cultures revere water. It's the foundation of the environment around us. What happens in that watershed directly influences and affects us directly. Of course, there's so many differences depending on where you live, what you have access to. But the healing power of water or nature is predicated on the safe use and handling of water. In medicine, we use water to affect physiology in the body. In the clinic I work in, every day we use hydrotherapy, a very old technique of hot and cold towels to affect circulation and movement in the body. This goes back more than 100 years. Hospitals where I grew up in upstate New York had closed down a little bit at my age, but were very prominent at the turn of last century. Were all built around mineral springs. It was common practice. Things changed in the U.S. around hydrotherapy or water therapy because of certain pressures in education. I think many people draw a line to the Flexner Report. That was in the 1910s. I think that was founded by industry that requested more demands on the rigors of science around medicine. But many people view it as a first step toward exclusion of science and medicine, where all of a sudden science pivoted and shifted more toward pharmacology. And I think it could make sense when you consider the landscape of the time where we were developing antibiotics and new systems. But unfortunately, it had consequences where it changed access to old healing practices that were very common and easily found in all communities, of which one of the most common was hydrotherapy. I remember as a young person getting a headache and cold compress over the forehead. You'd turn an ankle or you get a bruise, ice. These are all uses of water to affect physiology and improve outcomes for our health. Chinese medicine is built around a system of herbalism using teas, where we extract medicine from plants using water. This goes back centuries throughout all traditions. Water is the most powerful of all these elements around us. It dictates our weather in many ways. It dictates our own physical, internal weather.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting that you bring up I didn't think about it this way, but I know I learned from Dr. Heiner just the whole how to lower a fever with just the cold socks and the wool socks over them, and it's worked like magic, without needing to give any medicine to my little daughters. And that is a water-based therapy.
A critical therapy, a way of managing and harnessing a fever. Much of the time we're taught to lower the fever or manage the fever differently when it's a critical part of our vitality. Water has always been used as a way of harnessing fevers. Depending on the degree and temperature rise, the application increases. For temperatures up to 99 degrees Fahrenheit, wet socks is a wonderful approach where we pull circulation peripherally. We lower the pain that people are experiencing, and we're moving the blood without elevating the heart.
It's amazing.
A very profound way of moving the lymph system and allowing our immune system, the white blood cells, to engage whatever infection ails us. If that temperature goes up close to 100 or even up to 102, 3, and 4, which we've seen a lot these last number of years, we just increase the surface area or contact of that cool application. Many of the teachers I've studied with had this quote, "Never underestimate the application of a cold towel." To bring ease and health to a person. One of the techniques when the fever gets quite high is called a Spanish mantle, where usually patients are at home, I'll have them take a thin cotton sheet, put it in water, wring it, and cover their whole body. In the clinic, we often see patients come in, younger kids with high fevers for a myriad of reasons. Ear infections are quite common for that. And it's always interesting to see the parent when I'm going to wrap that child with a cold towel. And they're like, "You're going to do what?" But of course, at that point, they're exhausted because when you're running a fever, you're pulling from your skeletal muscle to drive that fever, and it's painful. That's why you hurt. And if you apply that cool application, you move the blood and you bring that temperature down just a little bit so it doesn't hurt. And within 30 seconds to a minute every time, they're asleep or they're playing with their toy.
It's amazing.
It is. It's an effective do no harm technique that allows our immune system to do what it's built for, to develop immunity that should last the rest of our lives. There's been quite a debate about immunity over these last few years, but no one argues the importance or the benefit of natural immunity. And water is a key substrate of affecting how our nervous system regulates blood flow, which of course is also rooted in water.
Yes. all things
circular.
Things go back, yeah. So the body is working with different systems. What are those systems, and what's the greater, most important system of the body, and why?
It's such a great question because everything works together in unison. There is nothing greater or lesser. Each has a defined role. For instance, the heart has to move the blood so that the tissues throughout our body get nourishment. The liver has to filter that blood, making sure that there's nutrition there, managing and conjugating hormone. Our kidneys are focused on that water filtration, but are really need the blood flow and function of the liver to do their job better. Our digestion dictates a lot of these things. When we look at our physiology, a lot of the time it's explained like a wheel. And outside the wheel, we have our liver, our lungs, our nervous system, our kidneys, all these essential organs. And at the center of the wheel is our digestive system. When we look at the digestive system, much of it is our lymphatic system. 70% of our lymphatic tree is around the gut-associated lymph tissue. The lymph system is a water system. And that gut-associated lymph tissue dictates a lot of our immune function. That hub of the wheel dictates how everything else in our body works. So if I had to be pressed to pick a priority of things, it would be the center, which is the digestive system. And in Chinese medicine, that represents the earth. And the earth is our vitality, right? We all recognize that. There's been a fascinating explosion of science around the microbiome, what we call the inner terrain of our digestive tree. And that terrain dictates so much of our immune function. And that digestive system contains hundreds, if not thousands, more cells than cells of our body. And it's required that it gets nourished, hydrated, supported, so that all of these other systems work efficiently. In our society, there are many symbolisms. I've always valued Chinese way of thinking in symbols because it's a way of conveying a lot of information with very little effort. The earth represents the mother, nourishing, endless giving, endless reservoir of life and vitality, right? Earth is what, in their Chinese paradigm, controls water, makes sure that it has boundaries, right? There's a cycle of control of how elements and systems work together. And of course, it's that digestive tree that is ensuring we're getting what we need while we're removing and getting rid of the things that don't work and we need to get rid of. And it's all doing so in the substrate of a liquid, water. Here in the West, when we look at medicine, we have cardiologists, kidney specialists, gastroenterologists. We all have our niche, but essentially all these systems are working together. In natural medicine, Chinese medicine, everything is integrated, working together as a functional system. When I had to write my thesis, I wrote my thesis on the lymphatic system, and I wrote a lot about water because that is the passage of water in our system. And it's a passive system. It requires us to move. It requires us to be active. It doesn't have a pump like a heart. It depends upon movement in order to move, isn't it?
I didn't know that. Wow.
I think
So if we don't move, it's not functioning very well.
correct. And what's happening to a lot of us now today?
Wow.
We're seeing children, 8 out of 10, who don't get enough activity or exercise for their normal growth and development.
So now you start seeing where disease comes from, right? It's like all directly linked.
If we look at our city, what would be similar? It would be the sewers and the streets, right?
It's
And
the sewage system of our body.
and if we're fortunate here in the Northwest because we have a lot of rain. And what does that do? You know, we
Movement.
just had a recent pollen bloom. It almost looked like a dust storm last week, didn't it? Where clouds of pollen from all of our evergreen plants just permeating the air. And then we fortunately had a wonderful rain come, knock that out of the air, and wash it through the watershed. And in doing so, cleaning that system. And when we have that kind of movement in a city, we don't get illness. Many cities of the past where toxicity built up in those sewer systems, we had explosion of illness and disease.
Because the water stayed idle. Nothing was flushing.
And in doing so, leading to vectors, potential infectious disease. You know, stagnant water can be a big issue for us, right? Because it gives rise to mosquitoes, another vector. So the lymphatic system in our body, similar to the sewer systems around us that we must maintain and make sure are clear, need to be clear. To keep that clear, there are many ways to approach it. We can approach it through hydrating. We can approach it through movement. We can approach it through shower, hot and cold. One of my favorite techniques to share with people is the Hunting response, which is vasoconstriction, vasodilation. So heat causes things to vasodilate, meaning move and open up. Cold, vasoconstrict. And in doing so, blood moves in and out of tissues. And in the process of doing so, the lymph moves.
Oh, interesting.
If
You
we-
just explained why people talk about cold showers and cold plunges. I didn't know that that was the science behind it.
When temperature is applied to our body, we can move and direct blood flow. I love the Hunting response because in physiology, it's a way of getting what they call the Golgi tendons to relax. Much of us have tension, and it's these Golgi tendons that are tightening up. If we alternate temperature just 2 or 3 times, that Golgi tendon apparatus relaxes. Right now, we're in a kind of a stimulating cycle where people like to jump into cold water, and it has tremendous therapeutic benefits. The skin is one of the biggest influxes of information to our nervous system. So there's a lot of therapeutic benefit. People need that shock, that need to wake up. But again, we have to be careful because in medicine, we also see the opposite side of where you can, through too much cold exposure, dampen or weaken your own thyroid or endocrine functions. So there's always a balance in any approach or therapy that we use. But I love that notion of using temperature with water. There's a reciprocal exchange occurring.
I love that. I never thought about it that way. I love it.
If you're enjoying the show, one of the best ways you can support us is by tapping those like and subscribe buttons and by leaving a comment or review. And don't forget to share this episode with a friend. Thanks for joining us.
So water health, what are some things that affect the quality of drinking water? What should we be aware of?
There's so many things depending on where we live and how water's delivered to us. Right now, there are certain levels of chlorine that are added to our water in very dilute amounts to ensure that as it's delivered from our water treatment facilities, it gets to us free of any illness or issue. But of course, as it flows through that system, depending on its age, depending on the infrastructure, it can pick up things. Some old homes, maybe built before certain eras, have lead pipes or lead soldering. The gold standard for many years was copper. Some people now have galvanized. Depending on where those things were produced and manufactured, they may be very strong and sturdy or very porous. Much of the time, the inner layer of these fluid systems develop a layer that becomes protected, and there isn't really much leaching after a period of time because there's a protective layer. Many engineering systems rely on that layer. Changes in water quality, maybe due to changes in the air, rain flow, the way systems and watersheds work, can change a little bit of the pH or change a little bit of the quality. But for the most part, we're at a state where the quality of water being delivered, particularly here where we live or across the states, has been standardized and really refined and well understood. The issue really, I think, comes from excipient contamination. What's been catching my attention and interest has been the rise of new contaminants. We see caffeine, we see antibiotics, we see antidepressants. I know that in certain municipalities, they can even look at drug use within a city by dissecting and looking at the chemistry within the fish of the water, the watershed. That's significant to me that we have that much of an impact with our personal choices in our communities, that it has this profound impact on the passive environment that we live in. Unfortunately, that has consequences, right? I think what's caught my attention as I've gotten older is how we've become very disposable. Our society has become disposable oriented, one-use type things. Things that we don't even really think about, like at the coffee shop when we're drinking out of our paper cup one time with our plastic lid. The pizza box that we're eating from, the bowl that we're eating from, potentially often has a coating to it. In the old days, that coating might have been wax, something that was a little bit more organic and easier for our bodies to process. Nowadays, unfortunately, it contains these forever chemicals because of their ease in use. I think Dr. Zach Bush's work around ionic gut health and the importance of helping get glyphosate, something that we're starting to see increase in our watersheds and increase in our food supply, but have dramatic consequences. It's classified as a small intestinal antibiotic. I think that was done in, about 2010. And when that happened, it was like a light bulb for me. We're getting this passive exposure through our food and water that has dramatic consequences on our own watershed, which is our digestive tree. And in doing so, we're seeing a myriad of neurologic complaints increasing, a myriad of health complaints increase. Why would those increases parallel standard of living improvements? It's, I think, the consequence of some of these issues that we haven't really looked at constructively around us that, quite honestly, relate to water and how water is delivered throughout the systems that benefit us and benefit society.
What makes drinking water vital, and how can we go about getting it?
Water is something that symbolically it's the most humble. It flows into the quietest of spaces. It has the capacity to dissolve and clean as well as nourish, right? The vitality is directly related to where that source is coming from as it flows through nature. We have aquifer systems. A lot of thought around the vitality of water centered around its movement, its vortexing. And as it's traveling, it's spinning, it's turning around rocks, tumbling. And as it's going through these movements, it's changing charge, it's getting potentized. One of the interesting things that caught my attention was water being exposed to light and this relationship to sunlight. And how sunlight has this effect of potentizing the water, bringing what some people note as vitality and vibrance. And it has to do with that fundamental water bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms and how it potentiates that bond and how that water molecule relates to the other water molecules. That was what I think a lot of these newer understandings of this fourth element of water, this structured water, of how these elements interchange. Water has that polarity. That polarity is what dictates its solvency and allows it to contain tea, allows it to wash the floor. In our body, dilute toxicity. Fundamentally, we all need to dilute our metabolic burden just from living, not just what we're accumulating. I think we're seeing a lot of that science now expand in its understanding that they're just not these three phases, that there is this other essence to water, and that vitality is directly related to sources, where water's coming from, how it moves through the environment.
What are some practical things we can do to actually get more vital water?
It can be as simple as a countertop water filter. It can be as complex as a reverse osmosis system. Over the years, having been interested in this for a long time before it was really even talked about or popular, I found myself leaning on simple carbon systems. There are a lot of companies out there that just use activated carbon. In fact, it has a long history of carbon just enhancing water. I know that in some traditions, just charring oak, there's a whole technique, I believe, in Japan about just dropping this into the water to activate and improve the water. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it, from simply adding something like charcoal to being advanced like reverse osmosis. And a lot of that really depends upon what you have access. Reverse osmosis is quite expensive if you're paying per gallon, right? Because it requires that you use more gallons, and it depends on your system, anywhere from 5 to 10 gallons to produce 1 or 2 gallons.
Yeah,
That's shocking for me. That doesn't work for me philosophically.
Yeah, not very
But
environmentally.
if you are living on a well and water's just flowing and it's free because of your well, that's a wonderful system because it can pull things out to a higher degree than other systems might. I've always leaned on simple filtration systems that have been developed for many decades now that just remove contaminants at about 99.999%. There's so many systems now that are available, more so than I remember 20, 30 years ago. And there's an incredible level of information and so many experts out there that can help guide people based on where they live, what stresses they have. Different municipalities might have different stresses on their water system. So understanding and talking to people who are experts in that arena for those areas is the best approach.
So there's many different sources for drinking water. There's municipal water, there's spring water, well water, groundwater, rainwater. Can you explain the differences or maybe the pros and cons of each?
Gosh, that's such a complex and great question. Each have their benefits. If we start with rainwater, because we can hear the rain a little bit in the background, rainwater is a way of cleaning what's going on in the environment. And so based on where you live and where you are and how you catch that water, it can have impurities in it. If it's being caught with your roof and you have an asphalt roof, you're going to have petrochemical contamination there. If it's a metal roof, you may not. So it really depends on where you live and what kind of system you have. When we look at groundwater, we touched upon something that influenced me in my childhood, where we saw contamination in groundwater causing a lot of problems. That can pose issues for people who want to just grow food in their backyard or have spaces in their basement and they're exposed to that groundwater passively. Of course, groundwater will also influence your fish and your hunting. Most people who fish and hunt know this and want to protect those systems, right? They're the ones who are very aware of the interrelatedness of the environment and watershed around them. Municipalities are different from area to area. Some places are fed with aquifers. Some are fed like we are from a forest and a glacier. It all depends on where you live. Some places it's coming from a lake. Other areas depend, as we've seen in the south, reservoirs. So as that water moves through those systems, it picks things up. It's a normal part of it. Much of the governmental and water treatment systems are all designed to catch these things and remove these contaminants and ensure that these get to our homes safely. Unfortunately, it's those systems of delivery in the home that can dictate what contamination is there. And as we mentioned earlier, what kind of industry around you might influence that as well. So this will dictate a lot of what choices you may have and also dictate the vitality of that water.
So when you look at all these different sources and know what goes into trying to clean them or make them drinkable, which one rises to the top as kind of...
It's an important question because I think in my short time that technologies evolve. And sometimes we have a great technology that we end up making a little bit worse, and sometimes we have something that we continue to improve upon. For the simplest approach, you would always think charcoal. It's accessible to everyone. It can be put back into the environment with little impact. It's easily found at every store at this point. It can be put on any countertop, so depending on whatever living situation you have, it's easy to use. When we look at big families and people who have a little bit more demand on their time and their water use, You would think that putting something in line that filters through a medium so that cooking and those things don't get inconvenient, right? And that we can make sure that the source and access to it is very quick and easy. Those would be the systems that I would lean more on. We understand this quite well. There's so many companies out there making these filter substrate systems that really do an effective job, even at pulling out PFAs and microplastics with great efficacy. It's just a matter of what you have access to and what your financial resources are. I think these technologies are going to continue to change because we're now recognizing that the way we were measuring these things in our environment is now an underestimate of their prevalence. And as that becomes clearer, innovation will adapt and give us better ways of filtering that water. But right now, for most of the patients in the clinic, I recommend a very simple inline dispenser that can be put right next to the sink. So it's, we wash and clean with our tap water, but our drinking and cooking water all come from that filter system. That water filter's changed usually once a year or every 10 months and has a low impact on our landfills and our environmental waste. So that's been the system that I've found as of now to be helpful in recommending to people.
I've heard that drinking water can be alive or it can be dead. Explain that to me.
Well,
and what minerals or what needs to be in water to make it alive?
Well, that's a great question because I would have to speak personally and just my own experience.
Yeah.
And
Great.
Mineral water, things that come from mineral springs are rich in nutrients, right? Meaning that they're picking up magnesium, calcium, all these important things that make our physiology, our body feel better. So when we talk about vitality, it can represent so many things. How it moves through the earth that's around us into our glass. And so is it moving through an industrial wastewater treatment facility, or is it moving through a gorgeous watershed flowing down a mountain off a glacier? We see many people buy bottled water right now.
That was going to be what I follow this up with, because I really want to ask you about bottled water.
Well, it's a complex question. What is your interest?
There's people that, for some reason feel like, especially in the global north, that maybe their water isn't safe and buy bottled water. But then there's also people, say, in the global south that don't even have access to clean drinking water and buy, out of necessity, buy bottled water. So, what should we be aware of in terms of bottled water, and can we do anything to make better choices?
What's really captured me recently, because it's something I've thought about for a long time, because plastics unfortunately leach chemicals and then they create waste, right? And so plastic bottles are certainly convenient. We can throw them in our backpacks. They're not going to break on us. But they leach plasticizers or phthalates that have some consequence on our body and our environment. Many of the things that have pivoted for me recently are just the effects of those areas that have access to water, where they give up their water rights and these companies come in and bottle this water and then ship it out. That can be a really wonderful situation for those communities if they benefit from those resources being purchased, but oftentimes those profits go to corporations that don't really live there or are really benefiting the communities. There may be some jobs, but I think as time goes on, we see water becoming the most important. What is the water rights? What is our access? Water, based on what your access is, and can really dictate your long-term health and vitality. When we see these natural disasters move through, or if we experience these situations like we witnessed a few years ago in Flint, where we had to ship in bottled water, it was a necessity to help prevent further damage. So there's always going to be a need to bottle water, to find ways to do it better, to recycle those resources, especially the packaging. Packaging is everything in food delivery, right? So It's a complex, again, another really profound, complex situation which demands us to ask questions of what's our short-term gain, what's our long-term cost, and what are the benefits, and how do those benefits get distributed properly, where people are benefited, communities are benefited more, versus their resources extracted and then that.
As a consumer, when I'm traveling somewhere where I can't have access to good tap water, how do I make a better choice? Is it like, if I have a choice between glass, metal, plastic,
I've always been a fan of glass or metal. Metal is obviously more costly now because it's such a important resource. Glass is a phenomenal packaging system. It's easily recycled and reused, repurposed. I think it's ideal. In fact, glass, it's essentially sand, right? And already has this long mystical relationship with water. And it's quite profound in that depending on how that's packaged, it's the best and most appropriate way to purchase water. I think my concern has always been from plastics or the leaching effects of these chemistries into the water or our food and the long-term effects that it has on our body.
So how is water an essential part of healing?
Well, being the fabric of our body, and if we look at the world around us, water in many ways dilutes toxicity. And water is a fundamental substrate of every system within our body and our anatomy. So as we go through whatever health challenge we experience, it's imperative that we hydrate and nourish ourselves internally. Water focuses on this ability to flush the system. So over the course of,
Get rid of toxicity.
yeah, the more water we drink, the more we urinate, the more our body is hydrated, the more our physiology functions better. A great example of things that we might not even consider is when we're dehydrated, our body has to grab water from compartments to manage. One of the compartments it may grab is the spine. And one of the important parts of our spine are the discs between the vertebrae. Now, when those discs are properly hydrated, they have the tensile strength greater than steel. That's astounding that this gel within our spine, a disc, has this tensile strength greater than compressive strength of steel. But if it's not hydrated properly, it's vulnerable to tear and fray. So function in our body is critically connected to how well we hydrate on a day-to-day basis, not just on the fabric of our musculoskeletal system, but also in how we detoxify, whether it's we're sweating, respiring, urinating. These systems require that we're properly hydrated. There are many things that we can do to add and improve our water, but there's nothing more important than just having a regular habit. I tend myself to forget. I'm constantly busy going. And so I often, people who know me, I'm always carrying a water bottle or it sits where I work. And my job is to get through that before the afternoon. And I fill it up again and I try to get it into me before the end of the day.
What can water or nature teach us about living in a symbiotic relationship with each other?
You think of what's the most divisible form of water, and it's a droplet, right? It's a circle, a sphere, kind of a hologram of our planet, the hologram of the space we're talking in. It's the thing that really unifies us all, isn't it? It's something that flows through all of us and animates all of us and is critical no matter what our divisions are, no matter what our backgrounds are or where we've come from. It's something that we all depend upon. Access to water is essential to a vibrant community, isn't it? It's essential human right, as you pointed out. And it also is reflective of our intention in the world, isn't it? How we maintain the environment in our communities directly relates to the quality of water we have access to, our way of thinking, how we view the world, how we deliver these things to our communities. It's such an interesting, and water, is it not reflective? Who doesn't remember the famous story of Narcissus being captured by his image in the water? We're in an era right now that everybody focuses on with narcissism and being self-centered, when in reality we have to be focused on this symbiotic relationship that we're all interdependent. And one of those key essential rights that we all share is water, both for our physical and vitality day to day. It's life-giving. It's next to breathing. It's the important thing that we do day to day, and we can't live without.
Yeah. How does water influence our kind of mental, emotional, spiritual body? Because I know we talked a lot about the physical.
Water is that substrate that delivers these nutrients, that expands our consciousness in many different ways. The quality of what we put into our body directly dictates our function, our abilities, our capacities. The environment around us is always going to have an influence on our internal weather, right? What's going on for us physically inside. There was always that adage, what's reflective in the microcosm is seen in the macro, and vice versa, right? Water is a very good subject for this, because depending on where you are and where you find yourself, it answers a lot of the questions, the history, where things stand socioeconomically. What season are we in? What's available to us? It answers so many questions about how we see ourselves and see our environment. So in answer to your question, I'm just taking a little liberty, because what's happening to our environment, which is mostly water, is going to have consequences to us internally. As we mentioned earlier, it's very common to study watersheds and to understand what's going on in the cities and communities around. So what you're asking is a universal question, and it really depends a lot upon our perspective and priorities too. What we're willing to ask, what kind of questions are we looking at in order to try to understand things more clearly, so that when we make our decisions on the micro level, we see long-term benefits generationally on a macro level.
What questions should we be asking to have more healing in our life?
Well, you can't climb a mountain in a day. It's something that you stage slowly over time. All of us, as we age, our priorities are changing. And in those changes, as we grow with experiences, we're always finding ways to improve ourselves and improve the lives of those around us. That is a process that will be till we take our last breath. It's something that we're always working on. Sometimes we don't have the time. Sometimes we have a lot of time to think and stew. But it's something that we do every day. And what I think is really powerful right now is everybody is paying attention to the consequences of their decisions and changing the way they vote and spend their time, voting through how they spend their resources. I think that's been the most profound impact for me over these last 10, 20 years, is watching how people are becoming more aware of how they spend and that influence it has on their communities and the vibrancy of their communities. These are the questions we're all facing. And, of course, we're talking about some privileged ideas here, because we have a lot of things that have been fulfilled that allow us to ask these really complex questions. We've talked today about water and its universal application throughout our lives, and how, when we look at it like a mirror, it's directly related to our past and past decisions, where we stand today. The big question is, what are the choices we're going to make as we look into that mirror as we move forward, right? I think now more than ever, with the way the world is shaping up and the questions we're all facing, we're more aware of what's going to happen generationally than we've ever had. I think that, to me, always poses great optimism. When the world shut down a few years ago, we saw some of the most dramatic things happen. Things corrected so quickly. We saw whales in the Hudson. We saw fish in the canals of Venice, things that people hadn't seen in their whole adult lives in those areas, things that were only talked about long ago. But when did that happen? It happened within months, months of just slowing down, reflecting. And I thought, for me, what a positive gem out of such a difficult trial and circumstance, showing just how profoundly we can impact the world around us by simply being still and doing things as a collective.
Yeah, it's almost like nature knows how to regenerate itself, right? We just need to stop messing with it,
Yes.
right? It makes me think of the body, like when patients come to you, how does that apply? Like, what are some practical things that they could do where they almost like get out of their body's way to like regenerate or heal itself?
Such a great question, because I think about it all the time, obviously, every day. Most of my days are spent trying to meet people where they're at and trying to find just simple, constructive ways to improve their routines. Health is really a routine. Health is just keeping simple routines that over time reinforce function and vitality. When we look at how do we approach our day-to-day, how do we improve our quality of life? It's just by developing simple routines and identifying those other routines that are limiting our life, that are causing gaps in our health and vitality. Often when patients come in, it's more of just listening. Much of my day is listening, asking questions, and just looking for ways to help them be inspired and engaged. That is really where we find the greatest growth, right? And that growth and that time is going to change. There's things that, as we evolve, stresses that occur, physical things that are going on for us. We're aging, where we live, what's happening to us day to day. These are things that put a burden on our body, right? The other is nutritive. What are we eating? What are we avoiding? What are we aware of? Sometimes just having clarity around what the best nutrition is for us individually. The other category, which is quite profound and has only been really recently appreciated in modern time, I think, for us in our culture, mental emotional. And right now we're probably living through one of the most trying mental emotional times. We've never, as a planet, ever been in the same existential stress. Some people are going to respond to it differently. That's just the differences between us all, based on our age, based on where we are, what resources, what our perspectives and backgrounds are, our cultures. But we're all facing the same issues. On a day-to-day level, we just have to ask ourselves simple questions and be self-reflective and observant. I think that's quite hard now because of technology. Every moment of every day, we're constantly on demand. It's about trying to slow down, I think, and looking at specific ways to improve ourselves day to day and support those around us when we can. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a while ago about that one town in Pennsylvania called the Rosetto Effect, where people in this town ate the same high-fat diet and didn't really had the standard American diet, but did not have any of the heart disease in relationship to the rest of the country. This Rosetto effect was people living in multi-generational homes, living in community, living in a supportive environment, having dramatic health benefits. I always try to focus on things to do, finding positive things to do. One of the number one things to do is to move your body. Our body's built to move. The statistic we talked earlier about what's happening to our younger generations where they're not getting enough activity also applies to us. When we're physically active and our blood moves, we get more nourishment to our tissues. And if our heart health stays strong, we will enjoy a long life. So activity's got to be number one. Number two, just eating whole foods, making sure that you can identify what you're eating. Next to that, sleep, right? It's critical to be able to recharge. If we're not getting enough proper sleep, we're really hampering our body's ability to regenerate. Next to that, got to be clean air, right? We have to get oxygen and have access to clean air. One of the biggest problems throughout society that we haven't really touched upon is chronic breathing problems. A few years ago, James Nestor wrote a book called Breathe, and it really kind of brought that subject to the forefront, something that would only be seen through actors, singers, professional athletes, these really critical subjects around breathing and making sure we're getting proper oxygen. We just walked through a healthcare crisis that asked us to wear masks, and in many situations asked us to hold our breath. And what happened is we became compartmental breathers. And right now we're not breathing, and we're, as a culture, collectively holding our breath.
Yeah.
And so it's never been more important to really breathe, and that can come through a myriad of ways. Exercise emphasizes better breathing habits. And then, of course, after those, you would have to say hydrating, right? Making sure that we stay hydrated and making sure that we're aware of what we're drinking. You know, it's really difficult today because, you know, we have to do things on the run. Much of the time when we're under stress, the worst thing we can do is add more, right? And put into our minds, I can't drink from this aluminum can, I can't drink from this plastic bottle, I have to have mineral
All that is
water, and
creating
just
more
pouring.
stress.
Yeah, and I had this water flown across the planet so that I can, you know, we're just putting ourselves in difficult choices a lot of the time. But often if we develop healthy routines around those subjects and making sure that we're supporting, you know, I've always loved looking at cultures that are happy, that live to be not just older, but vital
Joyful
and joyful. And you look at the Scandinavian cultures, and what is their secret? They're always at the top when they poll the populations of happiness and vitality. And I spent some time trying to understand that. And I thought one of the national poets, I believe, of Finland put it really well when he said, the secret to life and joy is being of service to others, to being of value to those around you. Fills you with purpose, fills you with drive, and it does something to the community around you. And I think that would probably be the most important out of all these things, because it ties that whole package together of trying to focus on what can we do versus what shouldn't we do. We can't change the situation we're in. We can only look and find the opportunity in these obstacles.
Yeah, 100%. My last question for you is, you say the most important part of our health is adapting and evolving. How do we get better at adapting and evolving?
Facing those obstacles and finding the opportunities. The greatest strength comes from adversity. Adversity, when faced and shared, collectively raises us above much of our problems. Division has never been a solution. What we've really started to lose for me is dialogue, because a lot of what we're talking about requires that we're all sharing information and sharing our different perspectives, making sure that we're all respecting each other's perspectives. I mean, that's what's made our community and really the foundation of this country in its short, you know, it's only been around a few hundred years, and we have our issues, we have a history, but our strength comes from the diversity, but a willingness to recognize truth and act accordingly, and not to continue to deny. So a lot of it comes from, I think, facing obstacles, looking together collectively for ways to improve, the opportunities to improve. There's more than enough room for all of us to have a difference of opinion and be able to disagree and agree to disagree, but to continue to move forward with clarity. And I think that's something I talk a lot about with people in their individual health. And I think about day to day is that health ultimately is clarity, having clarity, meaning things are very obvious and easy to understand. We have an inner knowing, right? Versus an internal anxiety, stress, confusion that leads us to disharmony or dis-ease. Something that always interested me was this concept of old eclectic physicians in their perspective of a vital force that animates us, right? The vital force is this internal wisdom, this internal balancing mechanism that naturally wants to heal. Much of our ailments and physical restrictions are due to a corruption in that vitality or that vital force. There was a doctor from the 18th century that I talk about that I think is pertinent to this point. His name was Emile Coué. He thought that a lot of ailments for people were due to suggestions or a reflection of what they were being told. Oh, there's nothing you can do. This is how it's going to be. Just go home. He had a term that he would ask his patients to do before they went to bed and every time they woke up. And it was every day in every way, my body is getting better and better. And it was a way, he thought, at his time of changing that internal dialogue or belief within oneself, that sometimes people start to identify with the problem and unfortunately become and live that problem.
Yeah.
So if I were to share something that I think has moved me in these last number of years, it would be this internal self-awareness as we walk through these difficult moments in these next number of years during our lifetime. Being more reflective and self-aware and knowing our unconscious biases and being able to put ourselves in a positive situation moving forward. It's not going to be easy. It's not how it's supposed to be. Positive things of value always come with difficulty. That's the first step of learning.
Thank you, Dr. Metro.
Yeah.
I appreciate you.
Yeah,
and
such a
your time.
privilege to you and your team.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. You can connect with Into Healing on TikTok and Instagram for more inspirational and behind-the-scenes content, and visit our website, intohealing.com, for transcripts and other goodies. Thank you for joining us.